A.K. Ramanujan as a poet. This question is also very important for the examination, and it may be asked like this: write down the poetic qualities of A.K. Ramanujan. So, first of all, you can give an introduction to the poet, and you can take another heading also, A.K. Ramanujan as an Indo-Anglian poet. So, all these are the main headings or main points to be written in the exams. The very first may be introduction or maybe A.K. Ramanujan as an Indo-Anglian poet, right? So, in the introduction, you will write all the important points about the poet. For example, don't forget that the full name of A.K. Ramanujan. The complete name was A for Attiput and K for Krishna Swami. So, the complete name of A.K. Ramanujan was Attiput Krishna Swami Ramanujan, and he was born in 1929 and he died in 1993. He was born in an Iyengar family, Iyengar southern family, southern Brahmin, and he was born in Mysore city on 16th of March in 1929, and he died in Chicago, okay, not in India. He died in Chicago on 13th of July in 1993 as a result of adverse reaction to anesthesia during preparation for surgery. So, A.K. Ramanujan, he started his academic career as a lecturer or as a professor, as a teacher in English. He taught about 8 years at the Maharaja University of Baroda, and in 1962 A.K. Ramanujan, he joined the University of Chicago as an assistant professor. He was affiliated throughout the rest of his career, teaching in several departments. And it is not important to write the name of his parents, because we are going to discuss the poetic qualities of the poet. But it is you can mention, if you write, that he was educated in English at the Mysore University and he received his PhD degree in linguistics from Indian University. Because he got his PhD degree in linguistics, so the effect of language can be seen very well in his poems or in his poetry. So, another point may be taken, bilingual poet, okay, bilingual poet. A.K. Ramanujan's poetic career or his literary career, which consists only of 2 volumes, and he is a bilingual poet. How? Because he composed poems in 2 languages, in Kannada and in English, with equal command. He was proficient, he was very good in both language, and this is why that he preferred to write in both. And it is always said that when he was hardly 17 years old, he started to compose poems. So we can say that he was a born poet, and this means that he had been writing poetry since when he was hardly 17 years old, means he was very efficient in composition also, and as a teacher, as a professor, he preferred to express his views through the composition. His views on poetry. Here you can write that what he thinks or what he said about poetry. The views of Ramanujan about poetry were that he because he has got the degree of PhD in linguistics, so his interest in linguistics influenced his conception of poetry and poetic craftsmanship also. He himself writes that he says, he writes in his poems, or he says that poetry must be learnt, poetry must be remembered, or poetry must be concerned with the form of poetry. A.K. Ramanujan, he paid his attention, he focused his attention basically on the form, okay, on not on the structure, that is on the form of poetry, and it was very important for him. The form, when we say that the form of poetry, that means that the way it begins and the way it ends, the way it begins and the way it ends. So his views on poetry were that the meaning is in the form. So poetry of course is made of words, but words are like objects used for creating something. So he preferred the form of poetry. Next point, we can have Indian experience. Indian experience in his poetry, or we can say Indian experience or Indian sensibility. Indian experience or Indian sensibility, okay. Here this point, fourth one point, we can take another heading also here, Indian sensibility in his poetry or Indian experience in his poetry. His poetry is full of, most of his poetry or most of his poems are full of Indian experience, Indian culture, Indian manners, Indian knowledge, and we can feel very well that how much experienced he was, because he was an Indian first, and it is an expression of Indian sensibility with his American experiences. Certain aspects of Indianness that he portrays have a universal significance, and this is why that we say we call it his Indian experience or his Indian sensibility. For example, there is an exploration, okay, there is an exploration of India's common heritage of myth and tradition. Fifth one is as a poet. A.K. Ramanujan as a poet, and his poetic qualities are based basically on his volume The Striders and Relations. A.K. Ramanujan as a poet, he has unique ways of expressing various issues of India which leave a permanent impression upon the mind of his readers, and the primary essence of his poetry is rooted very deeply, and it can never be separated from his poems, and because that represents the tradition of Indian sensibilities. So many of his poetic creations that are included in his famous collection of poems like the Striders. It is Striders or Relations, apart from his translated poems, and bear the mark of Indian sensibility presented through memoirs, past experiences, written poems, use of myths, legend, tales. Various techniques has been used by him in his poems. So his profound knowledge of India and its culture and Western culture is superb. This is why that we call him a great poet. In order to express extraordinary feelings of Indians, he likes to make a decent blending, a decent mixture of both culture, of Indian culture and of Western culture. Then themes, a theme of his poetry. Theme of his poetry. So what is the main theme of his poetry? Particularly conflicts, okay, family relations. But if he writes about family, that is also, there is also a conflict. So his favorite theme, which we always find in his poem, is a conflict. Means he relates his personal and familial conflicts and frustrations to the Indian traditional environment. Distance lends historical touch to his family poems. So he looks across an alien culture and a vast ocean to find his roots in Indian myths and in Indian tradition. Language and his poetic style. Ramanujan, he has polished very well and he has refined his poetic style. He chooses words very carefully, and but the words are very simple and of everyday use. Readers can never feel any problem in understanding the language, the words, or the poetic diction of A.K. Ramanujan, because they are so simple to be understood. A.K. Ramanujan, he observes economy in the use of words. We can say that whatever he says in shortness, in briefness, and he tries to use the fewest words for his message, whatever he wants to say. So he uses for that very suitable, very apt or proper, meaningful words, which helps him to achieve terseness and condensation. So his diction, his poetic diction, is also very, there is a classical simplicity in his poetic diction also. So his poetic style and his language is also very perfect, because they can touch the heart of his readers. Another quality is symbolism and imagery. Symbolism and imagery, no doubt that the poetry of A.K. Ramanujan is symbolical and it is imagistic. His images are precise, accurate, real, and they are very suggestive, or we can say that they are highly suggestive. They create vivid visual effects on the mind of the readers, and he always prefers the concrete image. To him, image is more important than thought, and in most of his poems we find a lot of imagery, a lot of symbol. That is a source of his expression. He, whatever he tries to convey, he prefers only symbolism and imagery, and with the help of imagery he says much more things into fewest words. Then, as a skilled craftsman, okay, another heading we can have as a skilled craftsman, because as a skilled craftsman he uses mostly monosyllabic words. He achieves a concentration of vowel sounds which makes his diction very musical. He also uses rhyme and assonance to create musical effect. He uses various stylistic devices to convey his meaning very clearly, eloquently, precisely, and very accurately. That verbal irony is also very important aspect of his poetic diction, and he also creates vivid poetic effects to repeating a common phrase, a common word is presented in a very beautiful manner. So no doubt that we find his this skill, his this crafts to compose the poem. Autobiographical elements. When we say autobiographical note, autobiographical elements, we find that A.K. Ramanujan, directly and indirectly, he has presented his personal feelings also in his poems. Personal conflicts, personal issues, personal problems, and personal conflicts, that is both inner and outer conflict. Okay, so inner and outer conflict, or his personal feelings, his personal experiences, his problems, each and everything can be seen very well in his poems. So there are no doubt, there are personal notes, or there are autobiographical elements also in his poem. Use of figure of speech. A.K. Ramanujan, it was not possible for him to compose poems or to say something without taking the help of figure of speech. He uses a lot simile, metaphor, personification, and with the help of figure of speech he says a lot of things, and for that he has to use very few words, so it helps him a lot. And there is no poem of A.K. Ramanujan when when we find that there is no use of figure of speech, and his favorite figure of speech is especially simile and metaphor. So in use of figure of speech, the readers, they can feel somewhat very complicated imagery and very complicated or complex thought or idea, because it is not possible for every reader to understand the simile or metaphor. But in spite of that, A.K. Ramanujan, he preferred the use of figure of speech. Now his poetic qualities. His poetic qualities, that is what all we have in his poem: free verse, imagery. Okay, all these are his poetic qualities. There is free verse. He uses free verse, so he writes his poem in free verse, but there is internal rhyme, and it shows poet's inner as well as outer conflict. He uses a lot imagery, symbols, figurative language, and there is of course internal rhyme. Great and gifted artist, no doubt that A.K. Ramanujan, he was a great poet, and he was a born poet, and he was also a gifted artist, because he is very natural at the time of writing, and it seems that the thought comes very natural. Oh, the thoughts or the idea come very naturally or spontaneously to him. So whatever he says, whatever he writes, that comes directly from his heart, and it goes directly to the heart of his readers. His use of universal issues, because he always takes the problems rooted very deeply, and he, whatever topic he takes for his poems, he takes only the universal issues. Means there are in his poems, there are various universal problems. For example, anxiety. Okay, anxiety, he talks of anxiety when he tells the state or the nature of anxiety. What is anxiety? It is, if he says that it is branchless, so at that time he is talking often of a universal issue, universal problem. And he says that an anxiety, when he talks of an anxiety, he is also talking of fear, of worries, of tension, of nervous feeling of youth or of man, because there is no person who is not suffering from fear or tension or worries. So most of his topics, his favorite topics, his favorite issues are universal issues, not Only Indian problems but universal problem. And there is also another poem, A River. In A River also we find that there is so many poems are composed based on this topic, A River. Okay, most of the poets, they have composed the poems based on river. But we can say that A.K. Ramanujan, he was only a poet who composes the poem based on such a river who was dried. Means the river, it dries every summer, and no poet sang of the river that dried. Instead, the poet sang only of the floods. Okay, they always composed the poem only of the floods, means they always presented the beauty of nature, the bright side of nature. But it was only A.K. Ramanujan who preferred to present the dark side of nature, means he preferred to show an another side of it. And other poets, they never showed, no human concern there was, but A.K. Ramanujan, he preferred to take such topics, such issues which were never touched by any other poet. So a river, an anxiety, these are the poems that can be composed only by such a great or gifted artist like A.K. Ramanujan. So you can conclude your this answer, A.K. Ramanujan as a poet, that no doubt R.K. Ramanujan was a skilled craftsman. His technical skill remains matchless in Indian English poetry, and his poetry is the poetry of a specific culture. He uses English idiom very skillfully, and his image craft is also unsurpassable. So in this way you can write, you can increase, or you can have an idea how you can write about A.K. Ramanujan. Okay, all these are the important headings. You can add any other heading also which you prefer. So the poetic qualities of A.K. Ramanujan, or A.K. Ramanujan as a poet.